The year is 1895. George B. Selden was granted the first U.S. patent for an automobile. The French captain Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of treason. Chicago debuted its first rolling bridge. And a band of white men, led by Sanford B. Dole, walked up the steps of Washington Place in Honolulu, Hawaii, to arrest Queen Liliuokalani for treason. She'd only been on the throne for 2 years, and already her world was crumbling around her. The archipelago her people called home was now in the hands of wealthy foreign businessmen. And so starts another episode of Crown Gilded and Screwed. My name is Cara May Adamo. If you're new here, welcome to the show. The subject matter is, well, unlucky royalty, or sometimes royal adjacent people, anyone born with a silver spoon in their mouth, or at least who acquires fame, fortune, and privilege young. And despite, or even sometimes because of that privilege, they're kind of screwed over. Life bites them in the ass, and then we talk about it. It's fun. So grab a Mai Tai and kick back and relax, because today we are going to be talking about Queen Liliuokalani, Hawaii's first and last queen. Let's start talking about Hawaii and how Liliuokalani got to the throne. And to do that, we're going to dial it back to 1778, when an ambitious adventurer named Captain James Cook was looking for something entirely different. The rumored Northwest Passage, to be exact. Cook and the guys financing him figured that if they went north, they could find a shortcut connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, which would enable easier and possibly even less conflict-laden trade routes with Asia. So on his way over, though, he stumbles onto something fascinating. It's a small grouping of tropical islands that he had never seen or heard of before. He looked around at the numerous Polynesians who'd been living there since about 300 CE and proudly announced that he'd discovered the place. You know, that thing where a European dude stumbles his way into a beautiful place and already owned by someone else, and then he proudly decides that he owns it. We love a tradition. Yeah. Anyway, at first, honestly, things were actually pretty chill. The islanders were as interested in Cook as he was in their land. This may have even been helped along a little bit by the fact that he supposedly showed up during a sacred festival. Now, we don't really have the Hawaiian perspective on things, so bear with me on this, but Cook insisted that the islanders thought that he was a god. It's giving Atahualpa meets Pizarro, if you all remember that episode. If you don't, check it out, we have it linked. God or not, Cook was initially greeted warmly, and he quickly fell in love with Hawaii, as anybody honestly would. He was eager to lick the boot of the dude paying him, so he renames them the Sandwich Islands because he was sponsored by John Montagu, who at the time was the 4th Earl of Sandwich. The trade-off, of course, was not even. Cook and his men enjoyed beautiful coastlines, and they took advantage of the natural resources, and the native Hawaiian people, in return, suffered from diseases like influenza and smallpox. Because Hawaii is super isolated in the middle of the Pacific, they had never been exposed to those illnesses before, and much like the native people of North and South America, they didn't have immunities to it. It wrecked their population. So the newcomers basically were like wearing out their welcome. Eventually, Cook does leave, and he continued his voyage north. This obviously did not bother the native Hawaiians in the least, and now Cook and his brethren, they're all headed north. They actually got pretty far. They hit Alaska, and they voyaged around that whole area, probably did some whale watching, the whole shtick. Eventually, though, he does realize that he cannot get past this massive sheet of ice that comprises the Northern Strait. So he turns his happy ass back around. This time, though, he gets caught in a storm, and his ship suffers substantially. It actually almost sinks, but he's scrappy and he manages to make it back to the beach. But the Hawaiians, they're pissed that he's back. So they're not exactly offering up their super secret best friend's handshake to him, you know? They're more like, bitch, what you doing here? We thought you were gone. A bunch of stuff goes down, including Cook capturing their king. He holds them ransom. And eventually, on February 14th, 1779, Cook was killed, very famously on Valentine's Day. And they meant business. Y'all, when I say they were pissed to see his dumb face again, he was stabbed multiple times by various native Hawaiians. And then they dismembered him, they cooked the skin off his body, and buried him all over the island. So take one of trying to capture and imprison a Hawaiian monarch didn't go great, as it wouldn't in most places. I'm not saying the dude deserved to be dismembered, but like, I mean, he stole their king, bro. So, you know. Regardless of the retaliation and the resultant Hawaiian victory that day, the damage was done. See, back when he was in Hawaii the first time, Cook wrote like a bunch of stories talking about this wonderful place that he'd, and I'm going to put this in quotes, discovered. His stories quickly spread throughout Europe, and eventually they brought European visitors far and wide, including explorers, missionaries, traders, whalers, etc., to the Hawaiian shores. So foreigners now knew about Hawaii, and things were about to change forever. The king Kamehameha the Great, he establishes the House of Kamehameha. His family ruled all of the islands as a group until about 1872. Now in 1819, his son Kamehameha II steps into the role. Around this time, American Protestant missionaries have started coming over, and they're converting Native Hawaiians to Christianity. They used their influence to get rid of a number of Hawaiian traditions. Then his brother, Kamehameha III, let's call him Trey, just to keep things a little easier to keep track of. He officially turns Hawaii into a Christian monarchy. Do understand that what he actually wanted to do was divide Hawaii amongst his people. He was calling it the Great Melee. At this point, Trey signs the 1840 Constitution, but foreign settlers used this to their advantage. They basically just found a way to acquire more land, which kicks the Native Hawaiians out of land ownership, further disenfranchising a people that up until like 70 some odd years ago didn't even know white people were a thing. Now, during Trey's reign, a little girl is born in a large grass hut at the base of what is known as the Punch Bowl crater off the island of Oahu. Her full name is insanely hard to pronounce, but I'm gonna give it a go. Liliuokalani Kamakeaia. Per tradition, she was named after a historical event. In this case, it was Trey's sister getting an eye infection. So her name is literally Liliu, which means smarting, Loloku, which means tearful, Walania, which is a burning pain, and Kamakeaia, which means sore eyes. So they named their kid smarting, tearful, a burning pain, sore eyes. But history knows her as Liliuokalani, and actually all of her friends called her Lydia. So we're gonna go with Liliuokalani. That's what we're running with. Now, despite being born in a grass hut, Liliuokalani was actually nobility. She and King Kamehameha, Trey, they descended from Kamehameha the Great. So they're both his descendants, which means that they are both, therefore, from House Kamehameha. She also had 6 biological siblings. Her and her brothers and sisters were then informally adopted by other high-ranking royal family members. So this process is called hanai, and at the time it was popular among both royals and commoners alike. So this was not an unusual thing. It was actually pretty standard in Hawaiian culture, and she is adopted through hanai. So she is handed over to Abner Paki and his wife Laura Konia, and she was also raised alongside their biological daughter, Bernice Pauahi. So she's now in that family, and that's kind of like where she stays. When she's 4 years old, she starts attending the chief's children's school. At that point, the king proclaimed that her and her classmates were eligible for the throne. This wasn't really necessary. It was kind of understood that you only went to this school if you were in line for the proverbial throne, but he more or less was just like announcing it to make it an official thing. But they wouldn't have really been able to go to that school had they not already been in line and eligible. The kids were taught English by American missionaries named the Cooks, and by all accounts, they were pretty strict. Liliuokalani actually remembered punishments like being sent to bed hungry, because there's nothing like some good old-fashioned child abuse to push your theological agendas onto a native populace that didn't really need them or ask for them. So again, we love a tradition. Yeah. Then in 1848, there's a measles outbreak, and it sweeps throughout Hawaii, and unfortunately her little sister succumbs to it, dying at only 3 years old. So understandably, Liliuokalani didn't exactly look back on her time at the chief's children's school all that fondly. It should also be noted here that Liliuokalani was an incredibly gifted musician. From a very young age, she sang, she was an alto, she also played the guitar, she was a pianist, she played the organ. She played the ukulele, and she also played something called the zither, which is kind of a cool looking like stringed instrument. She didn't just take lessons though. Like, this girl composed masterpieces, and a lot of them are still familiar to Hawaiians today, which is pretty badass. Anyway, at the age of 15, Liliuokalani graduates, finishing third in her class, so kind of with honors essentially. At that point, she moves back in with her adopted Hanai parents into this coral pink house on King Street in Honolulu. Haleakala is the name of the house. She seemed to really like it there, and she refers to Haleakala as her childhood home throughout her life. That same year, her parents hosted a 31-year-old American merchant named Gorham Gilman as a house guest. Despite their 16-year age gap, Gilman tries to hit on her, but he completely struck out. He would be one of many men to actually try for her hand. And before long, she was known as kind of the it girl of her time in Hawaii. A lot of people were quoted saying things like the Honorable Lydia was the highest unmarried woman in the kingdom. Like, she's the one everyone's after. She's very pretty, she's very talented, and more importantly than anything, she's highborn. So, in 1855, Kamehameha IV ascends the throne. Trey kicks it, his son steps in. At this point in her life, she starts to become quite the well-known socialite. She's incredibly popular, she's kind of a hot ticket at the time, and then a year later, the king announces that he has fallen in love with a young beauty, Liliuokalani's old classmate, Emma Rook. Now, despite the fact that she was also nobility, people at court were kind of shitty about them as a couple in general. Part of this was because Emma's grandfather was British, and they didn't really trust that because, they're Hawaiian, and obviously there's already been a weird precedent there. But so they didn't really love it, but they loved who they loved, and that's who they wanted to be with. Basically, people at court very openly compared Emma to Liliuokalani, telling the king that there is no other chief equal to you in birth and rank but the adopted daughter of Paki, meaning Liliuokalani. This made Emma burst into tears. This poor girl was absolutely crushed. And it pissed off the king because, that's his girl. Liliuokalani, on the other hand, had no interest in the bajillionth Kamehameha. She really just wanted her friend to be happy. So she comforted Emma, she stayed close friends with her, and basically kind of told her not to sweat it, let the haters hate, y'all are happy together, who cares? Emma and Kamehameha did end up getting married, and Liliuokalani was actually her maid of honor at the wedding. So, it's kind of cool. We love a girl's girl. Besides, Liliuokalani had her own bae. In 1857, she became engaged to a guy named William Charles Lunalilo. And honestly, it kind of seems like they were probably a pretty good match. First of all, they'd known each other since childhood. They had been really good friends for a really long time. Let me tell you, those can make some of the absolute best romantic relationships of your life. And they also shared a passion for music. So they had shit to talk about. Honestly, I think it made a lot of sense that they wanted to be together. The powers that be, however, begged to differ. They were against it for whatever reason. And the bishops and the king, whose marriage, again, just to be clear, she fully supported and stood up for, and was there in the wedding party. The king and these bishops all banded together against her and William, and they sadly ended up having to call off the engagement. Now, during this time, there was another dude kind of waiting in the wings, and his name was John Owen Dominus. So like William, John had known Liliuokalani since they were kids. He had been around the whole time, but since William was around, she never really paid much attention to him in that way, But now that William was out of the picture, John saw his in. So one night after a court excursion, he offers to take her home, but his clumsy ass fell off a horse and broke his leg. But he was determined to hang with her and honestly not miss a shot. So John hobbles alongside her and still manages to get her to home safely. She was either impressed with his grit or was just amused by his clumsiness. Either way, this gimpy motherfucker somehow managed to get her to go out with him as a result of this. I don't know. I guess she figured you gotta get over one by getting under another. Whatever happened there, the bishops must have been cool with old John, and he was the king's secretary, so he didn't have a problem with it either. And as a result, they were engaged by 1860, and then they married in 1862. They moved into his family's house on Washington Place in Honolulu, and wouldn't you know it, but John very suddenly secured a position as mayor of both Oahu and Maui, thanks to his wife's connections. Isn't that wild how he suddenly landed a high-end political gig out of nowhere? What a lucky devil. John, to be clear, was a dick. Yeah, he was just the worst. He married up because he's a klutz and she was single and vulnerable and rebounding and God knows what else, but he was not a good husband. Just as an aside, y'all never marry your rebound. We don't marry our rebounds unless you make sure that your rebound is like a really good person and you're in it to win it. But otherwise, don't do it, honestly. John, frankly, cheated constantly and he was never there for her emotionally. He basically married her and leveled up and then did whatever the fuck he wanted. Which brings me to my next dating rule. Don't break up with people just because someone else is against your relationship, or at least make sure that their reasons are sound and they make sense. And definitely don't date someone else that they approve of just because they approve them, because they might not know what the hell they're talking about. Since Liliuokalani was royalty, this rule doesn't really work for her because she didn't really have a choice, but none of us are royalty. And I just think it's important to establish that as like a boilerplate guideline, you know, make your own decisions, use your brain. Anyway, John's cheating, she's miserable, but they make a pretty good power couple, and that's pretty much all he wanted in the first place anyway. Also, his mom didn't really like her because John and her were American and Liliuokalani was Hawaiian. So even though she's royalty, that racist bitch still had issues with her marrying her son. Lucky for John's mom, Liliuokalani and John never had children of their own, so she didn't really have to deal with that pesky and existential thing where you're sort of racist against your own grandkids and all of that. Wouldn't that just be bothersome for her? The bitch. Anyway, nonetheless, Johnny Appleseed does, however, plant his seed elsewhere, and one of his various affairs resulted in an illegitimate son, also named John because, as we all know, we can only have 3 boy names per episode. So Liliuokalani was her normal, chill, incredibly wholesome self about all of this, and despite John breaking her heart, she actually adopts little John Jr. as her own, and she actually remains pretty close to him. So she was able to look past it, not blame the kid, props to her, maternal instincts kicked in. Eventually, she actually inherits a house of her own, and she moves in, but doesn't give John a spare key. She allegedly literally sang through the halls because she was so over his dumb shit. And I like to imagine her just sipping rum when eating girl dinner with all of her biddies and, you know, just living it up as the independent, don't need his crap bad bitch that she was without John. Regardless of that, she actually kind of ignored him anyway. And despite him saying no, she ends up adopting 2 other children. So he didn't give her children, but she went out and acquired some anyway out of the kindness of her heart, and was still able to be a mom with or without her shitty husband involved. And honestly, props. Get you some agency, girl. She was also super busy outside of the house. She retains a position at court, hangs out with her bestie, Queen Emma. The 2 friends actually decided to pool their considerable power and resources. They raised enough funds to build what is known as the Queen's Hospital. It's actually still around today under the name the Queen's Medical Center. So incredible work, ladies. Hats off to you. She also goes on to work with Princess Victoria, that's King Kamehameha V's sister. They built up and established the Kahamuanu Society for the Elderly and Ill, which is a civic club, and again, that also exists today. Then in 1866, Kamehameha V decided that he was sick of hearing God save the Queen at official events because it was his damn kingdom and he wasn't exactly an Anglophile. So he asked Liliuokalani to write the new Hawaiian national anthem. She sits down and does what honestly she always did best. She composes a stunningly ethereal piece that she named Hemele Lahui Hawaii. Basically, that translates to the song of the Hawaiian people. So she writes the new national anthem, and that was in place for quite a few years. So despite having a not so great love life at this point, Liliuokalani is super busy doing a lot of amazing things for the Hawaiian people, and also working to establish diplomatic relations with foreign dignitaries on behalf of the Hawaiian kingdom. And she's being a mom, despite the fact that her husband didn't want her to be. So again, we love her. Everything runs more or less smoothly until Kamehameha V dies in 1872. Now remember, up until this point, House of Kamehameha has been in charge since the 1700s. And unlike his predecessors, Kamehameha V didn't leave any heirs to inherit the throne. So according to the 1864 Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom, which was established during his reign, they had to elect somebody in his place. And guess who they elected? Any guesses? It was her ex, William. They elected her ex. The one she loved and played music with and had a relationship with and wanted to marry. They elected him because life can be a bitch. Unfortunately, it's actually really a bitch because poor William actually doesn't last very long. He died 2 years later and also had 0 sons or daughters to leave in charge. So now we have a problem. They have to have another election. So now we have Liliuokalani's brother, David Kalakaua, who is running against her buddy, who is the now Dowager Queen Emma, Kamehameha IV's widow. Emma and David are running against each other. So the race was not a pretty one. Emma was super pro-British. Again, her grandfather was British. And David, by contrast, was actually much more pro-American because he was interested in business opportunities that a lot of these Americans are establishing throughout the islands. So he's rubbing shoulders with all these business guys, and he thinks that like he's one of them. Neither of them, it seemed, were super interested in keeping Hawaii traditional and frankly sovereign, which is only depressing Liliuokalani. Ultimately, the Legislative Assembly chose David, and the result was honestly kind of their own January 6th. And I mean that sincerely. An angry mob of about 100 of Emma's followers storms the place and straight up riot ensues. They take over the courthouse first, and then gradually they just begin taking over other buildings throughout the city, so it's spreading. There's actually a carriage parked outside the courthouse waiting for the official election results at this point. The idea here was that the driver was going to deliver the answer to David, who was waiting at home to find out if he was the winner. And y'all, the mob ripped this carriage to shreds. I don't know what happened to the driver. I hope he was okay. But like, they destroyed this thing. This was not a peaceful march. So unfortunately, at this point, the Hawaiian army had actually been disbanded after a mutiny before all of this happened. So they don't have the resources or the infrastructure to stop what's going on. So Hawaiian officials were faced with this really difficult decision to reach out to American and British sugar merchants and Navy officers, which importantly means that now Americans and Brits are being asked to intervene in Hawaiian politics during a civil dispute. That's a big difference between how they were acting before. American Marines were also there, and they went straight for the courthouse. They pushed back the rioters, and they placed guards everywhere. They also occupied the city armory, the treasury, and the prison. And that's important because it's actually filled with prisoners that Emma had promised that she would free if she was elected. But now obviously everything's gone to shit. So now the prisoners are pissed off, so they've got to deal with that. Again, a mess, chaos. This whole ordeal is insane, and it becomes known to history as the Honolulu Courthouse Riot. It was not, to be honest, without Hawaiian casualties. I specify Hawaiian because apparently neither the Brits nor the Americans lost anyone during the mayhem, which is, it's a good thing. Apparently none of them were even hurt that bad. And we don't want people hurt, so that's good. But sadly for the Hawaiians, it was another story. It was an absolutely bloody, tragic, again, mess. David took his oath of office after all, and he proclaims his brother an official prince, and he proclaims that his sisters are official princesses, which of course includes Liliuokalani. So now she's a legit princess. She's living in Hawaii. She's married, but living separately from John. And her people are super divided now. In 1881, David goes on a royal world tour, which is of course pretty traditional at this point in life for foreign royals, leaving Liliuokalani in charge as regent in his stead. Unfortunately for her, around this time while she's in charge, a contracted Chinese laborers had been brought to the island, and they were largely blamed, whether it was legit or not, for a smallpox outbreak. So honestly, she actually kicks into action though. She closes the ports, she initiates a quarantine. This helped keep the outbreak secluded. It only stayed in Oahu and Honolulu for the most part. The other islands were largely untouched except for a couple of cases that showed up in Kauai, but otherwise it basically stayed there. She visited a leper settlement at one point, and she was profoundly affected, like emotionally. She didn't have leprosy. She just felt super empathetic towards those who did. She actually convinces the Hawaiian Board of Health to set aside land and build a hospital for those that had the disease. And that just continues on what at this point starts becoming kind of a lifelong interest in helping the sick. So she's a very empathetic person, and civic duty is incredibly important to her. 5 years later, she founded a bank for women called Liliuokalani's Savings Bank, and even helped institute a lending service specifically to help women in securing loans, which is so rad, because again, this is the 1800s. And to put this in perspective, women in the United States were not allowed to have their own bank accounts until 1974. 1974, a full-ass 88 years after Liliuokalani created the institutions in Hawaii. 88 years later. She also established a school for underprivileged girls. She felt that it was really important for women of all classes to have opportunities and a proper education, which again, we love that. To put it mildly, Liliuokalani loved her people. She had a genuine dedication to philanthropy, to civic service. She took her position as a royal princess and regent very seriously, and she worked super hard to sustainably raise her people up, despite the growing disenfranchisement around them. Ushered in, of course, by the American businessmen taking more and more interest in Hawaii, and of course, more land. Also remember that David, her brother, the actual king, he's in bed with these guys, so it's an uphill battle for her, but she's fighting it. In 1887, David sends his sister off to attend Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. She attended the main event. She attended multiple festivities related to it. She had a really good time. She also toured around North America for quite a bit at that point. She spent some time in San Francisco. She went to Boston. She also went to the White House. It should be noted, by the way, that Hawaiians had electricity in their palace and public buildings, but the White House was still running on traditional gas lamps at the time. So comparatively, she was actually used to more modern conveniences than those that she found in DC, which I found to be pretty wild. While she was gone, however, David finds himself in hot water. He's forced to sign what is now known as the Bayonet Constitution, and by forced to sign, as the name suggests, this was a sign it or die situation. The Constitution was drafted up by businessmen that basically owned David's ass. They stripped him of pretty much all authority. He was basically just a figurehead by the time it was all said and done. It also instituted property qualification for voting. Basically, it said you had to own at least $3,000 worth of property to cast any votes in Hawaiian elections. That qualification would amount to about $100,000 today, like worth of property. But you also have to consider property valuations over time. So that's actually not even a direct comparison. It was probably likely a lot more property than that. This obviously just fucked over the Hawaiian people even more, along with immigrant laborers, but it was fabulous for wealthy white people, as always. Shortly after this, David headed out on another trip. He leaves Liliuokalani in charge again. Everyone kind of said that he was just going to California for like his health, but some suspected that he was really heading to DC in secret to continue talks about annexing Hawaii, which would mean that Hawaii would turn into a US territory instead of remaining a sovereign kingdom. It needs to be noted here again that by this time, David had fucked up. He was allegedly in debt to a bunch of the businessmen that he'd helped gain power and prestige. And he already kind of belonged to them thanks to the Bayonet Constitution. So if he was trying to do that, that might have been part of why. Regardless of his reasons of travel or travel plans, David doesn't really get very far. Liliuokalani soon gets word that her brother has a stroke while in California, and he dies a couple of days later. On January 29th, 1891, Liliuokalani took the oath of office. She was officially Queen of Hawaii, restricted, of course, by the Bayonet Constitution. The first thing she did was ask her brother's cabinet members to move aside. They flatly refused. They obviously didn't want to give up, their positions. The issue was pushed to the Hawaiian Supreme Court, and she did get her way, at least for the moment. The ministers did step down, but now they're pissed. And because she was still married to John, he was crowned Prince Consort, and he was restored to his governmental position in Oahu, which he had lost during the signing of the Bayonet Constitution. So John gets a little bit of his power back, which honestly still means a Hawaiian family is gaining more political control. And then on August 27th, John died. He died right then. She went on record to say that the one time she finally needed him, he wasn't around. So basically he was like completely worthless until, like, to her, until he finally wouldn't be, and then he kicked it. So thanks, John. Thanks. So now she's flying solo and kind of trying to keep shit under control. Over in the US, William McKinley was actually a representative in DC. He pushed for and got tariffs placed on Hawaii. And that caused the price of imported Hawaiian sugar to skyrocket. Because that's how it works when you institute tariffs. You know, just saying. To combat that, the price of sugar on the Hawaiian side of things begins to tank, and it rocks the Hawaiian economy. So now we've got these tariffs in place. It's fucking everybody over financially. So for 171 days of her short reign, the legislation of Hawaii had the longest damn meeting ever. And this thing could not have been an email. Alongside the tariffs, they discussed the potential for a lottery, an opium licensing bill, because the 1800s were a whole other world, and of course the whole cabinet member thing, since, you know, Liliuokalani pissed those dudes off. She did manage to get other guys she wanted in place of them, with the intentions of promoting a new constitution that would reinstate the monarchy and toss out the American wannabe oligarchs. The principal move for this was honestly to really give voting rights back to Native Hawaiians, though. That was really the biggest goal of this in the process of being drafted constitution. And this honestly is where all of our backstory is really important for context, because the Constitution had been reworked over the years to only grant voting rights to those landowners. And thanks to American, and if we're honest, British businessmen, that meant wealthy, like, non-native white guys. So the power wasn't in the hands of Hawaiians as it was meant to be. It was an on-paper way to infiltrate the government prior to possible US annexation. So insanely unfair and obviously vicariously somewhat racist. So all of these investors had far more voting rights than Hawaiians, than the actual native Hawaiians, and it was absolutely destroying Hawaiian culture and completely disempowering and embittering a Hawaiian people. Sanford Dole, he and a bunch of his buddies established something that they rather ironically called the Committee of Safety. In response to the Committee of Safety, the other party, the Royalists, established the Committee of Law and Order. So you've got two committees. You've got the Committee of Safety on this side, and those are like the American, you know, dude bros. And then you have the Committee of Law and Order, who are giving speeches in support of the Queen. She also, by this time, agrees to stop promoting her new constitution so that she can keep the peace, because she doesn't want more unrest than she's already dealing with, because she does really care about her people. At that day, Marshal of the Kingdom Charles Wilson is tipped off that there is a coup that's being planned. So he has 13 members of the Committee of Safety arrested, and the entire Kingdom of Hawaii was put under martial law. Fun. Then Wilson gathered up close to 500 men, and they're all basically set there to establish a protection measure for the Queen while these negotiations between the Committee of Law and Order, her, and the Committee of Safety are all attempted. To make it clear that the Committee of Safety did not represent Hawaiian interests, Dole demanded that she sign power over to him. But she detests him. She hates him. And she doesn't want his greedy, grubby little hands all over her desk. So she passes temporary control over her kingdom to the US government instead. She has hopes at this point, having hung out in DC with US officials, that she would get them to agree to officially hand it over to her and just end this whole mess. Dole, honestly, mostly just ignored her. He establishes a de facto government, and he requests a formal annexation to the US government, which basically means that now the US government is receiving conflicting requests from these people. As compensation for her losses, the US Senate voted on a $20,000 annual pension for Liliuokalani, which would be just under $700,000 annually today. They also passed the agreement to do a $150,000 one-time lump sum to her niece, who would have been her heir, and that would be just over $5 million today. So they did pay, I guess, but still, like, she didn't want the money. She wanted Hawaii to have control over its own government because she saw what these rich businessmen were doing to her people. You know, like, it's not always about the money, guys. Sometimes it's about something more important. At this point, she writes to Grover Cleveland, who is now in office. She remembered him from DC and asked him to reinstate her. And Cleveland listened. He had his officials investigate the coup, and they look into it, and they decided that she was right. The overthrow was completely illegal, and there was no evidence that they did it the right way, and it should have never happened. He even agreed to give her the throne back in exchange for amnesty for those responsible. Here's where emotions kind of get the better of people, and that can include kings and queens. Liliuokalani got pissed off. She didn't just want the throne back. I mean, she did want the throne back, but she also wanted blood. She wanted revenge at this point. Remember, they instigated a coup. They manipulated her dumbass brother. They essentially stole land from her people. And instead of amnesty, she called for death sentences, which is not the same. On December 18th, 1893, President Grover Cleveland informed Congress that the U.S. had illegally overthrown the Hawaiian Kingdom, calling it an act of war. He stated that the U.S. troops had unlawfully landed in Honolulu on January 16, 1893, enabling the provisional government's takeover. Without U.S. military support, Queen Liliuokalani would have remained in power. Now, despite this admission, the U.S. did not restore the Hawaiian Kingdom, and the provisional government, led, of course, by Sanford B. Dole and the Committee of Safety, remained in control. And that, honestly, brings us all the way back to the beginning of our story, when Dole and his henchmen stomped up her front steps and arrested her for treason. They dethroned her illegally, and somehow still managed to arrest her for treason, which blows. It just does. There's no other way to say it. She was imprisoned in an upstairs bedroom in her own house, and the whole place is swept for weapons. And honestly, they did find several firearms in the house at the time, for hunting, I assume. She abdicates her throne in exchange for lifted death sentences for all of her supporters. She did look back on this time in her life while she was writing her memoir, and this is what she said about that decision. And I'm actually going to quote her here. Quote, "For myself, I would have chosen death rather than to have signed it. But it was represented to me that by my signing this paper, all the persons who had been arrested, all my people now in trouble by reason of their love and loyalty toward me, would be immediately released. Think of my position. Sick, a lone woman in prison, scarcely knowing who was my friend or who listened to my words only to betray me. Without legal advice or friendly counsel, and the stream of blood ready to flow unless it was stayed by my pen." Powerful words that really give insight into the dilemma she felt. She eventually was tried for treason and initially sentenced to 5 years of hard labor and a $5,000 fine. That was eventually changed over to just imprisonment within the palace, so she was essentially under house arrest. While she was under house arrest, she did the thing she loved the most. She composed songs. She also began working on what would eventually become known as the Queen's Quilt, where she wove in images and words and symbols that commemorated and represented her culture, because she was so afraid that it was rapidly disintegrating in front of her, and she wanted to preserve it. She was forbidden from reading newspapers at this point, but her followers still managed to slip her some anyway by, and I'm not making this up, by wrapping fresh flowers in said newspapers daily. And this worked. I'm glad it worked, on her account. Ethically, I'm glad that it worked. But I'm also kind of pissed that they fell for it. I don't know, ethically, I love it. I love it for her. But I hate it for incompetency. I'm so torn. I'm honestly torn. I hate incompetency in that, it's a lot. They just literally handed flowers with the newspapers that were banned, and it worked. Liliuokalani eventually was granted a full pardon in 1896, and after being stuck inside for an eternity, she wanted to GTFO for a while. So she took off for Massachusetts and stayed there for a hot minute. She headed down to DC often enough, was able to plead for compensation that she felt was still owed to her because of Cleveland's initial ruling. During this trip, she attended the inauguration of a new president, William McKinley. The dude who pushed for all those tariffs back in the day. Him. Yeah. See, after appropriating the renaming of Denali, which is a beautiful mountain in Alaska, instead naming it after himself, calling it Mount McKinley in the most small dick energy move ever, he'd managed to secure the White House. I say this having lived in Denali State Park back in my 20s, and I'm proud to announce that since I lived there and moved back, they finally did restore it to its rightful name, so it's Denali again, goddammit, and no one can say otherwise in my presence. Anyway, McKinley is now warming the seat of the Oval. He signs the treaty for the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands, but it failed to pass in the Senate at first. There was a lot of back and forth about whether or not to reinstate Liliuokalani, and nobody could really agree on it. For a little while, she actually felt like her negotiations were going pretty well, all things considered, until the Spanish-American War broke out. And for her, this was at pretty much the worst possible fucking time. Basically, the US government decided that they wanted a position in the Pacific and that Hawaii was the perfect spot for it because they already had a naval base over in Pearl Harbor. So strategically speaking, it made the most sense for them. And by the way, that is the reason that we will never give it up, no matter how little sense it makes otherwise for us to own it. That's essentially the reason. Culturally, it's a whole other world. Annexation was pushed through and she was unfortunately not reinstated, so they did fuck her over. Liliuokalani was invited to the annexation celebration, we'll call it, which honestly, like honest to Christ, just sounds like a Dr. Seuss thing. She was basically forced to watch them tear down the Hawaiian flag, which was her flag, and then replace it with the American one, which, you know, again, great times, what a party. And for more than 60 years, they remained in that sort of famed purgatory of being a US territory, taxed but without statehood or voting rights. You know, kind of like Puerto Rico. Taxation without representation. It's almost like we had a damned war about that once, I think. Memory gets fuzzy sometimes. Traditions. Plantation owners and capitalists alike kind of liked it that way, to be honest, because they were able to import cheap foreign labor and sort of do whatever they wanted. I will say in 1959, they did finally become a state. Hawaii did finally become a state. As soon as that happened, they were able to benefit from the subsequent infrastructure. It began to modernize, and it finally became this incredible tourism mecca that it is today. As for Liliuokalani, she lived out the rest of her days in Honolulu. She played music, she mourned her political losses, but she was surrounded by a resilient people who remained loyal to her for the rest of her days. She also remained close to the adopted children that she lovingly raised, so her desire to be a mother kind of worked in her favor, and she wasn't super lonely. She did have family, and she did have people that she cared about and who also cared about her. Later on in life, when she did write her memoir, she said, and I'm going to quote her again because it really speaks to her love of music and how it got her through things. Quote, "To compose was as natural to me as to breathe. And this gift of nature, having never been suffered to fall into disuse, remains a source of the greatest consolation to this day. Hours of which it is not yet in place to speak, which I might have found long and lonely, passed quickly and cheerfully by, occupied and soothed by the expression of my thoughts in music." She died in 1917 at the age of 79 years old, which is actually the year before my grandmother was born, which is that's kind of cool. That like gives you shivers a little bit. She was buried in the Royal Mausoleum of Hawaii. Liliuokalani's story is an interesting cautionary tale because it depicts so clearly what can happen when oligarchs, particularly businessmen with little to no civil-mindedness, empathy, or respect for other cultures, are kind of given carte blanche to do whatever they want. And the Dole Food Company still owns the Dole pineapple plantation to this day, which was established and pushed along by Sanford Dole's nephew, who showed up once his uncle was in office. They are still present in Hawaii today, and they've also expanded throughout the world since then. To be honest, it really doesn't look like their questionable business practices ended with Liliuokalani and her people. Back in 2005, they and Chiquita were sued by Colombian workers, alleging the use of militias against their workers. Dole's part of the suit was dismissed, but Chiquita was actually forced to pay $25 million in restitution. So, you know, it was a joint suit, just saying. Then Dole was sued again, this time over the alleged use of dangerous substances on banana trees that were poisoning farmers. This was actually covered in the 2009 Swedish documentary called Bananas on Trial for Malice. And it covers the conflict between the company and the banana plantation workers in Nicaragua. It does need to be noted that the filmmakers were hit with a defamation lawsuit by Dole, but Dole also lost that lawsuit, and it was forced to pay them instead. As a response to this, the filmmakers then hit them with a second documentary in 2012 that covered the defamation case, which is just chef's kiss, because I imagine that the money that they acquired from Dole probably financed it, which, it just makes you warm and fuzzy inside when that happens. Again, we're saying alleged here, but you might want to look them up. Make sure that you determine how you feel about them and their continued approach to workers all over the world. It could be better. We'll just say that. All of this said, I will tell you that Hawaii is an absolutely beautiful place to visit, and the people are wonderful. I've spent time in Oahu and in Kauai, where my partner, our producer, Chaz McNeese, and I hiked the Kalalau Trail, which is actually what this tattoo is. And that's actually where they filmed Jurassic Park. It is also the birthplace of our incredible editor, Resilio, and it was actually his idea to cover Queen Liliuokalani, and we'd really love to thank him for that, because up until now, I honestly hadn't heard much about her, and she was absolutely incredible, and I'm really glad that we took this time for her. We are going to link out her music in the descriptions below, and we encourage you to give it a listen, especially the link to Aloha Ue, which, according to the source that we got it from, is actually a recording that was done in 1890, so contemporary to her time. The song was officially voted the most important song in Hawaiian history in 2007, and it remains coveted over 100 years after her death, and it's just such an important, beautiful piece of music. Basically, this is just an incredible legacy to leave behind, despite the absolute bullshit that was thrown at her. So thank you for joining us. If you liked this one, please like, subscribe, comment, share it with your friends, all of that. It helps us create more episodes. It keeps my drink full. We appreciate it more than you know, and we are overwhelmed with the support we've already gotten from the show. We are a new channel, and we're trying really hard to produce really good episodes for you. So thank you so much for sticking with us and for jumping on board if you're new. If you do want to follow us on the socials, you can find me on Facebook at Karamea Adamo. It's going to be actually on screen. Our production company is on there and on Instagram under Mayward Productions. You can find this show on Facebook at Crown Gilded and Screwed. And right now, at least for right now, we are also on TikTok. I'm under @KaritaMay, and the show is @crowned_gilded_screwed, or at least we will be as long as our overlords allow it. Again, I'm your host, Karamea Adamo. Shout out once more to Resilio for a great episode pitch. We loved it, and we hoped you did too. And thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.